Hello everyone. I wanted to do a video about vampires and what are vampires and where did they come from. So you might know that vampires are created from demons, or might be demons, or at the very least they're undead, immortal beings that go around and drink people's blood to stay alive, and they can be killed by the sunlight, or either that or they sparkle according to Twilight. And werewolves are their mortal enemies. I think that's been established. And yeah, and they're either evil or they're misunderstood or they're certainly sexy. And where does this come from? Where does this whole story come from? And you might think, well, it came from Twilight. You know, that's the big vampire story. But it didn't actually. That's not the first story of it. It's also not True Blood, it's not even Buffy. In fact, if you go back further, it's not Interview with a Vampire. It goes back to Dracula. And Dracula was a movie. It's not just the Bram Stoker's Dracula with Keanu Reeves in it. Which wasn't all that good, but actually I didn't mind it. But it was actually a story from the late 19th century, as in 1897, I think it was. But Dracula, the story, actually is based on Dracula, the person, who was a real person, who ruled a place called Wallachia, not Transylvania, but still Transylvania is within Romania, and so is Wallachia. So it wasn't too far from Transylvania, and he ruled it from 1451 to 1477 in at least 3 phases. And he was around from 1432, I think it was. And so why was he the inspiration? Why was this real person Dracula the inspiration for the book Dracula? Well, and the reason was because Dracula, that was kind of an honorific, was a title. His birth name was Vlad Tepes III. So he was the ruler of Wallachia. And his title, or honorific, was Dracula, which meant son of Dracul. Dracul was his father. So his father was also Vlad Tepes, but his father had an honorific of Dracul. So as to distinguish between them, Dracul's son's name was Dracula, Dracula. And that, in Dracul itself, so Dracul, not Dracula, meant dragon. And it was because of a title bestowed on them by the Holy Roman Empire, which was the Order of the Dragon, which basically meant defenders of the Christian faith. So Dracula meant defender of the Christian faith. And because Romania at the time was sort of being invaded by a lot of Muslims, a lot of other people too. And so there was a big need from the Holy Roman Empire to sort of protect it from these Muslim invaders. So they said, well, we'll make you the Order of the Dragon to protect it. Now some people have told me, oh, Order of the Dragon wasn't really a big deal, but for them it was. And Dracula was known as a hero in his native area, still is. And so if you say, oh, he's a vampire, they will get very upset. You go into Romania and you say Dracula was a vampire, they'll probably kill you. It's very insulting to this day. And so what was the whole thing about being an impaler and impaling people on stakes? So this is something that people did at the time, all over the world, when they were sort of saying that whoever they killed and impaled on a stake was a vampire. Because that's what you did to vampires, you impaled them. And if you had their heads stuck on the stakes, of course, that shouldn't necessarily kill them though. I don't know. There's a whole story about that, and basically you're saying my enemy is a vampire. Or you might just be showing their heads, I don't know. But essentially he was accusing all of the people that he'd killed of being vampires. And pretty rude, really. And it was essentially saying all these Muslims, all this entire empire were vampires. They did not like that one little bit, because Muslims also believed in vampires. Because Muslims and Christians had a lot of shared beliefs, still do, and they had copied that belief in vampires from the Jews, because vampires started with the Jews. Now I know that some people say, oh, but there's Babylonians, Sumerians, all these other people that also believed in vampires, and they did. But that goes back before the Jews, which the Jews will say to you, oh no, Judaism was the first religion. So saying before the Jews, you get to have this big argument. So for the sake of argument, I'm going to say that it started with the Jews. So he was known as a vampire hunter, a vampire slayer. So the real Dracula was a vampire slayer. He was Buffy. He wasn't a vampire, he was Buffy. He was the vampire slayer. He was the anti-vampire. And he was Christian the whole way through. He was a mighty defender of the Christian faith against all comers. And yeah, he protected that land to his death with everything he could, protecting them. And yeah, of course, the Muslims are the ones that went with the claim that he was a vampire, because they were like, well, we're not vampires. He must be, because he killed us. So, you know, all the people that were involved in attacking him, especially the Muslims, they were the ones that called him Vlad the Impaler. That wasn't really what he was called by the people that liked him. That was a Muslim claim. It was a smear on his name. And, you know, you have these war of words, as you often would. So the idea that he was a vampire is a Muslim belief. So if you went to the Muslims at the time and their descendants and so forth, they would be saying, oh no, Dracula was a vampire. You know, because that's kind of what you did. If you didn't like someone, you'd call them a vampire. And this is one thing, is that if you look back through history, you will find all this evidence of these vampire hunts that people went on. You might know about the witch trials. So the witch trials, of course, when usually women were rounded up because of an accusation that they were smart, that they'd read a book, and they would be tried and either drowned or burned at the stake. Often burned at the stake quite publicly. And witches, of course, were real. So they may not have flown around or anything, but witches was just a name for a priest from other religions. Essentially any other religion other than Christianity. You were called a witch. In fact, if you just believed in another religion, you were called a witch. And today, people still call themselves witches. That is, if you're a member of Wicca or a neo-pagan religion, you will often call yourself witch, and some people call themselves witch doctors. It's essentially another word for priest, but not of a Christian faith. Because in a Christian faith, you call yourself priest, and then you have this hierarchy: bishop, cardinal, all that sort of thing, and pastor if you're a Protestant. And that's the thing. So if you're not a Christian, you're a witch, and that was essentially that's what that meant. Or it could be just an educated woman and so forth. But vampires were worse than that. So, you know, if you were accused of being a vampire, you were just killed on the spot. You didn't have a trial. You would just have this massive wooden stake thrust through your heart, breaking your rib cage, and that'd be it. And if you resisted, they would chase you until they would kill you. And there are all of these people that were buried with evidence that they had had stakes thrust through their hearts. They have broken ribs in a certain area where the heart would have been believed to be, and which was, of course, we believed it was on the left, whereas it's actually in the centre. And so that's where vampires kind of come from, but they actually originate from someone called Lilith. Lilith is a Jewish tradition, not in Christian tradition, but it kind of flowed over into it. So it's not actually in the Bible, but belief in Lilith predates that. And so Lilith was the first human. So the first three humans were Lilith, Adam, Eve. Eve was created from Adam. Lilith was created as an original being. And she, of course, turned on Adam, refused to lie with him, refused to have sex with him. And she did all these terrible things to get back at God. They had a big argument, and one of those things was that she became a vampire. She was the first vampire. Now, I know some people will say, oh no, there were other vampires before that. She was only one of many. According to Jewish tradition, she was the first vampire. So you're talking about vampires being women and seducing men, and then they become incubus, which are lesser vampires because female vampires were called succubus. Lilin were children of vampires, or children of Lilith at least. And there were other things as well, and they ate babies and did other terrible things. So that's where the vampires come from. That's it from me. Bye bye now.